Christmas Eve has a way of disguising danger. It wraps houses in light, covers old arguments with music, and convinces people that for one night, nothing bad can happen. That illusion is powerful. It makes people lower their guard. It makes them trust. The Whitmore house stood at the end of a quiet street, its roof lined with soft white lights, the kind chosen deliberately to look calm and welcoming. Snow had fallen earlier in the evening, not enough to disrupt travel, just enough to make everything feel peaceful. From the outside, it was a picture-perfect holiday home, the kind neighbors would later say they admired, the kind no one would ever associate with a crime. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with familiar Christmas scents, roasted meat, baked bread, cloves, and sweet wine gently warming on the stove. The dining table had been extended to fit everyone, covered with a red cloth Emily Whitmore had ironed herself that morning. She believed details mattered. She believed appearances mattered even more. Daniel Whitmore sat at the head of the table, relaxed, smiling, playing the role everyone expected him to play. At 46, he was well known in his community, dependable, successful, respectable. A man people trusted with money, advice, and secrets. He had built his reputation carefully over decades, and tonight he wore it like a tailored suit. To anyone watching, Daniel looked happy. Emily sat to his right, graceful and attentive, refilling glasses, asking polite questions, making sure no one felt ignored. She had mastered this role years ago, the supportive wife, the perfect host, the woman who made everything look effortless. Her smile was practiced, steady, never revealing what lay beneath. Across the table sat Daniel's younger sister, Margaret, quiet and observant, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had arrived alone, as she always did, carrying with her an unspoken history that hovered in the room like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. There were also two close friends, neighbors who had shared holidays with the Whitmores for years, people who knew their routines well enough to feel like family. Laughter rose and fell naturally. Stories were shared, some repeated from years past, others exaggerated with each telling. Glasses clinked, plates were passed, the kind of evening that felt safe because it was familiar. But familiarity can be dangerous. No one noticed the subtle shifts at first, the way Emily watched Daniel more closely than usual, the way Margaret avoided looking at her brother when he spoke about the coming year, the way Daniel himself seemed distracted, his smile faltering briefly whenever the conversation turned toward family plans or finances. There were things they all knew and things none of them dared say. Earlier that month, Daniel had made decisions that would quietly change everything, decisions he believed were private, decisions he assumed he had time to explain. He was wrong about the time, and dangerously wrong about the people he trusted. As dinner progressed, Emily stood and poured wine, careful not to spill a drop. She knew exactly who preferred red, who preferred white, and who would accept whatever was offered. When she reached Daniel, she filled his glass last, steadying the bottle with both hands. "Long year," she said softly, meeting his eyes for just a moment. He nodded. "But it's almost over." The words meant different things to each of them. Daniel raised his glass to make a toast, thanking everyone for coming, for being part of their lives, for sharing another Christmas together. His voice was calm, confident, the kind of voice people trusted without question. When he finished, everyone drank. No one knew that choice would matter. The conversation drifted again, touching on harmless topics, travel plans, work gossip, neighborhood news. Christmas music played faintly from the living room, a familiar melody looping again and again. Time moved forward the way it always did, second by second, unnoticed. Then Daniel paused. At first it seemed insignificant. He stopped speaking mid-sentence, frowned slightly, and placed his hand flat against the table as if steadying himself. Emily noticed immediately. She always noticed. "You okay?" she asked, her voice calm, almost casual. "Just dizzy," Daniel replied with a small laugh. "Must be the wine." He took another sip anyway. Margaret watched him closely now, her expression unreadable. She had spent years reading her brother's moods, his expressions, the subtle signs others missed. Something felt wrong, but Christmas dinners weren't the time for suspicion, not yet. Minutes passed. Plates were being cleared. Dessert waited in the kitchen untouched. Daniel's breathing grew shallow, his skin pale beneath the warm lights. His fingers trembled as he tried to stand. This time there was no laughter to cover it. The chair scraped loudly against the floor as Daniel collapsed forward, knocking over a glass that shattered on the hardwood. The sound cut through the room, sharp and final. For a split second, no one moved. Shock freezes the body before it frees the voice. Emily screamed his name. Panic followed instantly. Someone rushed to his side. Someone else called emergency services, hands shaking so badly they struggled to dial. Margaret stood frozen, staring at her brother's still form, memories flooding back faster than she could process them. Christmas music continued playing in the background. By the time the paramedics arrived, the house had transformed. The table was abandoned. Decorations felt out of place, almost mocking. Emily knelt on the floor, sobbing, her hands clutching Daniel's arm as if refusing to let go of the moment before everything changed. The paramedics worked quickly, professionally, but their expressions grew more serious with each passing second. When one of them finally looked up and shook his head, the room went silent. Daniel Whitmore was dead. No one cried out after that. Grief settled heavily, suffocating, unreal, the kind that leaves people numb rather than hysterical. Emily's sobs faded into quiet, broken breaths. Margaret sat down hard in a nearby chair, her legs giving way beneath her. Police arrived soon after, their presence instantly changing the tone of the night. This was no longer a medical emergency. It was now something else. Questions were asked. Names were written down. The house became a place of observation rather than comfort. At first, the assumption was simple: a heart attack, sudden, tragic, unpredictable. But assumptions have a way of unraveling. One of the paramedics mentioned it quietly to an officer. Daniel had no known heart condition. His age, his health, the lack of warning signs. It didn't fit neatly. Not enough to accuse, just enough to wonder. As Daniel's body was taken away, Emily watched from the doorway, her face blank, her tears gone. Margaret noticed that too. The absence of grief can be just as revealing as its presence. That night, after the house was cleared and the guests were sent home, Emily sat alone at the dining table. The broken glass had been swept away. The tablecloth remained stained with wine, or perhaps something else. She stared at Daniel's empty chair for a long time, longer than anyone would expect. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the street in silence. Christmas Eve ended the way it always does, quietly, gradually, unnoticed by the rest of the world. But inside that house, trust had already been buried, and justice had just begun its slow approach. Morning arrived without apology. The Whitmore house looked ordinary in daylight, almost peaceful, as if nothing extraordinary had happened within its walls just hours earlier. The snow from the night before had settled into neat, untouched lines along the driveway. A wreath still hung on the front door. From the outside, it was just another home waking up after Christmas Eve. Inside, it felt hollow. Emily Whitmore had not slept. She sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket she did not remember grabbing, staring at a mug of cold coffee she had no intention of drinking. The chair across from her remained empty, Daniel's chair. The absence felt heavier than his presence ever had. When the knock came at the door, she already knew who it would be. Two detectives stood on the porch, their expressions neutral but alert. They were polite, respectful, and deliberate, the kind of people trained to read what others tried to hide. Emily invited them in without hesitation, her movements controlled, almost rehearsed. Grief, when real, is unpredictable. Hers was not. They began with simple questions. What time had dinner started? Who arrived first? What had Daniel eaten? What had he drunk? Emily answered calmly, too calmly, providing details with impressive clarity for a woman who had lost her husband less than 12 hours earlier. Margaret Whitmore arrived shortly after, called in by the investigators. She looked tired, her eyes red, her posture guarded. She sat quietly as the detective spoke, listening more than talking. Unlike Emily, she struggled to answer questions without emotion. Her voice wavered when she spoke Daniel's name. That did not go unnoticed. Detective Harris, the lead investigator, observed both women carefully. Years of experience had taught him that truth often revealed itself not in words, but in contrast. One woman was composed, the other was unraveling. By mid-morning, the coroner's preliminary report arrived. Cause of death was no longer assumed. There were substances present in Daniel's system that should not have been there. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. A slow-acting compound, difficult to detect without testing, easily dismissed as natural causes if no one bothered to look closely. But they had looked closely. Detective Harris felt the shift immediately. This was no longer a tragic accident. It was now a suspicious death, and Christmas Eve of all nights had just become a crime scene frozen in memory. The house was sealed. Officers photographed the dining room, the glasses, the tablecloth, the kitchen counters. Every object that had seemed ordinary the night before was now potential evidence. The wine bottles were collected, the glasses were bagged individually, the trash was searched thoroughly, piece by piece. Emily watched from the hallway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Margaret watched too, but differently. Her eyes followed every movement, every bag sealed, every note taken. Her mind returned again and again to the moment Daniel had hesitated mid-sentence, to the way Emily had been standing closest to him when his glass was refilled, to the quiet tension that had hung in the air long before he collapsed. Trust doesn't vanish instantly. It erodes slowly, and Margaret could feel it crumbling. The investigators began expanding outward. Financial records were requested, phone records followed. Daniel Whitmore, it turned out, had been making changes in the weeks leading up to his death, subtle ones. Legal consultations, adjustments to accounts, a revised will that had not yet been finalized. Someone stood to lose a great deal. Someone else stood to gain even more. Emily was questioned again that afternoon, this time at the station. She wore the same clothes as the night before. Her makeup was flawless. She answered every question with patience, never raising her voice, never appearing offended. She spoke of her marriage as stable, loving, occasionally difficult, but normal. She denied any arguments, any recent tension. She smiled sadly when mentioning Daniel's stress, attributing his collapse to exhaustion. When asked about finances, she hesitated just briefly, then explained that Daniel handled most of it. She trusted him completely, she said. The word trust came easily to her lips. Margaret's interview followed. Her story was different. She spoke of distance, of strain, of Daniel's secrecy in recent months, of arguments overheard, dismissed as private matters. She admitted that her relationship with her brother had not been perfect, but she insisted she would never harm him. Her grief was raw, unfiltered. When she cried, she made no effort to stop herself. The detectives compared notes. That evening, the autopsy report was finalized. The substance found in Daniel's system was confirmed, administered orally, mixed carefully, enough to weaken him slowly before stopping his heart. It was not something he could have ingested accidentally. Someone at that table had poisoned him. Now the question became simple and terrifying. Who had the opportunity? The wine bottles were tested first, nothing unusual. The food followed, clean. That left the glasses. Daniel's glass alone contained traces of the compound, which meant the poison had not been shared. It had been personal. Investigators returned to the timeline. Who touched Daniel's glass? Who refilled it? Who stood close enough long enough to add something without being noticed? Emily's name surfaced repeatedly. She had refilled the glasses. She had stood beside Daniel moments before he collapsed. She had full access to the kitchen, to the cabinet beneath the sink, to the house itself. Still, suspicion is not proof. They dug deeper. Insurance records revealed a policy taken out just 3 months earlier, substantial, enough to change a life. When asked, Emily claimed it was a responsible decision, one they had discussed together. But there was no record of Daniel's signature approving it. Phone records told another story. Arguments captured in text messages, late-night calls, deleted threads recovered by forensic analysts, words exchanged that spoke of resentment, control, and fear of exposure. Daniel, the man everyone trusted, had been keeping secrets, and Emily knew them. As night fell again, Detective Harris stood outside the Whitmore house, looking at the softly glowing Christmas lights still blinking along the roof. They hadn't been turned off. Perhaps no one had thought to do it. Perhaps no one wanted to. Christmas, he thought, was the perfect disguise. People don't expect betrayal wrapped in tradition. They don't imagine murder happening beneath a tree decorated with ornaments and memories. But that was exactly what had happened. Inside, Emily sat alone again, this time aware that the walls were listening. Her composure began to crack in small ways, a tapping foot, a clenched jaw, a stare held too long on nothing at all. Trust had been broken. Now suspicion had taken its place, and soon it would demand answers. Suspicion changes the way people behave. Once it enters a room, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles quietly, reshaping conversations, altering eye contact, turning ordinary questions into calculated exchanges. By the 3rd day after Daniel Whitmore's death, suspicion had wrapped itself tightly around everyone who had been present at that Christmas dinner, but it lingered longest around Emily. Detective Harris noticed the change immediately. Emily's cooperation had not wavered, but something about her certainty now felt rehearsed rather than natural. She answered questions before they were fully asked. She anticipated angles investigators hadn't yet explored. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she understood the system well enough to stay ahead of it. People who are innocent often fear being misunderstood. People who are guilty fear losing control. The investigation widened. Daniel's work life was examined next, and what surfaced surprised even those who thought they knew him well. Behind his public image as a reliable, ethical professional, Daniel had been navigating a web of quiet disputes, financial disagreements, promises made and delayed, partnerships strained by mistrust. None of it illegal, none of it violent, but enough to show a man under pressure. Pressure creates fractures, and fractures reveal motives. Margaret was the first to be ruled out. Her finances were modest but stable. No insurance policies, no debts tied to Daniel, no recent arguments severe enough to suggest violence. Her grief, though painful to witness, aligned with what investigators had come to recognize as genuine loss, unpredictable, exhausting, and deeply human. Emily's situation was different. A forensic accountant laid out the numbers carefully, page by page: credit card balances, private loans, quiet transfers between accounts. Daniel had been tightening financial control in recent months, limiting access, questioning expenses, preparing for something he hadn't shared openly. Emily, it seemed, had been losing freedom she once assumed was hers. Emails recovered from Daniel's personal device revealed consultations with a lawyer, drafts of a revised will, trusts being adjusted, assets redirected. Emily's name appeared less frequently in these drafts than it had in earlier versions. That discovery shifted the investigation from suspicion to motive. Detective Harris understood something crucial then. This was not a crime of sudden rage. It was a crime of anticipation, of someone who saw loss approaching and chose to act before it arrived. Still, motive alone wasn't enough. They needed proof of action. Attention returned to the poison itself. The compound was uncommon but not impossible to obtain, not something sold openly but accessible through certain channels if one knew where to look. Online searches, medical literature, chemistry forums, the digital footprint mattered. Emily's laptop told a story she had not intended to share. Weeks before Christmas, she had searched for symptoms that mimicked heart failure. She had researched substances that metabolized quickly. She had read articles about delayed toxicity, about deaths initially ruled natural before being quietly reclassified. She had not searched once. She had searched many times. When confronted with this information, Emily remained calm. She explained it away easily. Curiosity, fear, concern for Daniel's health. Stress makes people research strange things, she said. She smiled faintly as she spoke, as though the explanation itself should satisfy them. But Detective Harris had seen this before. Too much explanation often hides the truth rather than clarifies it. Meanwhile, the trash recovered from outside the Whitmore house underwent deeper analysis. Christmas wrapping paper, empty bottles, food containers, ordinary holiday debris. And then something else. A small plastic vial, empty, unlabeled. The residue inside matched the compound found in Daniel's system. The timing mattered. The vial had been discarded on Christmas Eve, shortly before dinner. Surveillance footage from a nearby home showed Emily stepping outside alone, something she had not mentioned during questioning. The moment lasted less than a minute. Long enough. Emily was brought in again. This time the tone was different. The detectives didn't accuse her outright. They didn't need to. They let silence do the work. They placed the vial on the table between them. They slid photographs across the surface slowly, deliberately. The searches, the footage, the financial documents. Emily's posture shifted, not dramatically, just enough. Her shoulders stiffened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the door before returning to the detectives. Control was slipping, and she felt it. She denied everything. She said the vial wasn't hers, that anyone could have discarded it, that the footage proved nothing, that the searches were taken out of context, that grief made people paranoid. She insisted Daniel loved her, that they had plans, that no amount of money could justify what she was being accused of. Detective Harris listened patiently. Then he asked one question. Did Daniel know you were afraid? Emily froze. It wasn't a question about poison or money. It was a question of truth. Her response came too late. Her eyes filled with tears, but not the kind born of grief. These were tears of exposure, of something hidden being dragged into light. She began speaking quickly, defensively, describing years of emotional strain, of being monitored, of feeling trapped in a life she could not leave without consequences. Daniel, she said, controlled everything. What she didn't say mattered just as much. She didn't deny wanting out. The investigation entered its final phase quietly. Charges were not filed yet. Emily was allowed to go home. The law often moves slowly on purpose, especially when it knows exactly where it's headed. Investigators wanted certainty. They wanted a case that would survive scrutiny, doubt, and defense. Margaret, meanwhile, wrestled with her own reality. She replayed that dinner endlessly in her mind, the glances, the silence, the moment Daniel faltered. She wondered how well she had truly known her brother, how well any of them had known him. Trust, she realized, is not built on truth alone. It's built on what people choose to reveal. And sometimes that choice is fatal. The warrant came days later. Emily Whitmore was arrested quietly, without spectacle. No neighbors watching, no dramatic resistance. She surrendered without protest, her face calm, her voice steady. She asked only one question before being led away. Did he suffer? No one answered, because justice does not exist to comfort the guilty. As Emily disappeared into the back of the police car, Christmas decorations still flickered in the background, untouched. The contrast was almost cruel, celebration and consequence occupying the same space. Detective Harris stood watching until the car pulled away. He knew the case was strong, but he also knew something else. Motive doesn't kill. Opportunity doesn't kill. Love doesn't kill. People do. And sometimes they do it smiling across a dinner table, beneath twinkling lights, trusting that no one will ever see what they truly are. Jail has a way of stripping time of meaning. Days blur together inside concrete walls where light never quite feels natural and silence is never complete. For Emily Whitmore, the first week in custody passed in fragments, clipped conversations, sleepless nights, and the persistent echo of her own thoughts looping without mercy. She had expected fear. What she hadn't expected was how loudly memory would speak when there was nowhere left to hide. She replayed Christmas Eve endlessly. The table, the lights, Daniel's voice, his confidence, the certainty with which he believed he controlled the future. In her mind, the story always returned to the same point, not the moment he collapsed, but the moment much earlier that day when she decided there would be no next year. Detective Harris understood this phase well. After arrest comes resistance. After resistance comes justification. Very few people confess because they suddenly feel remorse. Most confess because the story they've told themselves begins to fall apart under scrutiny. Emily's lawyer advised her to remain silent. She nodded, agreed, and ignored the advice entirely. She asked to speak with investigators again on the 5th day. The interview room was small and intentionally uninviting. No decorations, no warmth, just a table, 2 chairs, and a camera mounted high in the corner. Emily entered composed, her posture upright, her expression carefully neutral. She looked like someone preparing to defend herself, not confess. Detective Harris did not rush. He asked about her childhood first, about how she met Daniel, about the early years of their marriage. He allowed her to talk uninterrupted, knowing people reveal more when they believe they are being heard rather than challenged. Emily spoke of love at first, of admiration, of safety. Daniel had been older, established, confident. He had offered her a future that felt stable, impressive, secure. She had wanted that. She still insisted she had loved him. But love, she explained slowly, had changed shape. She described control disguised as concern, questions framed as care, decisions presented as necessary rather than negotiable. Over time, her life had narrowed without her noticing. Friends drifted away, independence faded. What remained was comfort without freedom. Detective Harris listened, taking notes sparingly. When she finished, he asked a simple question. Why Christmas? Emily inhaled deeply. Because Christmas, she said, was symbolic, because it was the one night Daniel would never suspect betrayal, because the house would be full, distractions plenty, assumptions strong, because people expect peace on holidays, not violence, and because, she added quietly, it felt poetic. That word hung in the air. Poetic. Harris let it settle before continuing. He asked about the searches, the vial, the timing. Emily no longer denied them. Instead, she reframed them. She described preparation not as malice, but as inevitability. She spoke of fear, fear of being left with nothing, fear of exposure, fear of a future where Daniel rewrote her life without her consent. She insisted she hadn't planned to kill him at first, only to make him weak, only to slow him down, only to scare him. The distinction mattered deeply to her, but the law does not measure intention in halves. As Emily spoke, her voice softened, her confidence wavering. She admitted she hadn't anticipated how quickly things would unfold. She hadn't expected his body to fail so completely. She had expected control, not death. Detective Harris leaned forward slightly. "You researched lethal outcomes," he said calmly. "You prepared a dose that could kill. You administered it knowing the risk." Emily said nothing. Silence stretched again. This time it worked against her. The confession, when it came, was not dramatic. It was tired. She admitted to placing the poison in Daniel's glass after refilling it. She admitted to disposing of the vial outside. She admitted she watched him drink, waited, observed the changes. She claimed she panicked when he collapsed, that she truly hadn't wanted him to die. But panic does not erase action, and justification does not undo consequence. The prosecution built its case methodically. Experts testified about the poison, about dosage, about timelines. Financial analysts explained the insurance policy, the will changes, the motive anchored in loss of control rather than gain alone. Digital forensic specialists detailed the searches, the deleted messages, the planning hidden beneath everyday routines. Margaret testified last. She spoke of her brother not as a victim or villain, but as a flawed man who trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. She spoke of Emily with sadness rather than anger, describing a woman who had seemed distant long before Christmas, withdrawn in ways no one wanted to confront. The courtroom listened in silence. Emily did not look at Margaret. When it was time for the defense, they attempted to humanize her. They spoke of emotional strain, of psychological pressure, of fear, of choices made in desperation rather than cruelty. But the prosecution returned to one unmovable truth. Emily had choices. She could have left, she could have confronted, she could have exposed. Instead, she chose silence, preparation, and poison. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict was guilty. When the sentence was read, Emily closed her eyes, not in shock, not in disbelief, in recognition, as if the ending had always been there, waiting patiently while she told herself a different story. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager for statements. Margaret declined to speak. Detective Harris offered only a brief comment. Justice had been served, but nothing had been restored, because some losses are permanent. That night, as Emily was transferred to a state facility, Christmas lights still lined the streets she passed through. Children laughed in nearby homes. Music played softly through windows. Life, indifferent and relentless, moved on. And somewhere beneath all of it, the truth remained simple. Betrayal does not begin with hatred. It begins with trust. Prison is not loud the way people imagine. There are no constant screams, no endless chaos, no dramatic reckoning played out in raised voices. Instead, there is routine. Doors opening and closing at the same hours every day, meals served without ceremony, time measured not in moments but in repetition. For Emily Whitmore, that was the hardest part. Nothing dramatic marked the beginning of her sentence. No speech, no final declaration, just a transport bus, gray walls, and a number replacing her name. The woman who once curated holiday dinners and controlled appearances now lived within boundaries she could not negotiate. Control, the very thing she had fought so desperately to reclaim, was gone entirely. In the early months, Emily told her story often, not to guards, not to officials, to herself. She framed it carefully, smoothing edges, softening blame. She spoke of fear more than choice, of inevitability rather than intent, of a life narrowed by another's decisions. It was the same story she had told investigators, lawyers, and the court, only now there was no one left to persuade. Over time, even that story began to fail her, because memory does not stay obedient forever. It changes when silence stretches long enough. Christmas came again that year. Inside the prison, decorations were minimal. Paper snowflakes taped to bulletin boards, a tree placed in a common area more out of obligation than celebration. For Emily, the season brought no comfort. It brought clarity she had avoided. She remembered Daniel's face more vividly now, not at the end, but earlier. The way he laughed when he thought he was winning an argument. The way he assumed time would always be on his side. The way he trusted that the life he controlled would remain intact. Trust, she realized, had existed on both sides, and she had destroyed it completely. Outside those walls, the world adjusted. Margaret Whitmore sold the house the following spring. She could not bear to keep it, not because of what happened there, but because of what it represented, the illusion of safety, the belief that knowing someone meant understanding them. She downsized, moved closer to friends, rebuilt her routine slowly. Grief, she learned, does not disappear. It reshapes itself. Some days it was sharp, other days it was distant, but it was always present. A quiet companion she had learned not to fight. Daniel's name faded from headlines quickly. That is how it always happens. There were no documentaries, no books, no public memorials, just a brief cautionary tale shared occasionally among locals, a story retold in fragments, a Christmas dinner, a sudden death, a wife who betrayed trust in the most intimate way possible. Detective Harris retired 2 years later. On his last day, he cleared his desk carefully, methodically, as he had done everything else. The Whitmore case folder was thin compared to others, but it lingered with him longer than most, not because it was complex, but because it was simple in the way that unsettles you. There was no monster hiding in shadows, no stranger breaking in, no moment of uncontrollable rage, just a decision made quietly by someone trusted completely. That kind of crime stays with you. Sometimes, Harris thought, justice is not about punishment at all. It's about truth being spoken clearly without excuses. And in this case, the truth was uncomfortable. People often ask how to spot betrayal. They imagine warning signs, obvious danger, raised voices, sudden changes. But betrayal rarely announces itself. It sits patiently at familiar tables, it pours drinks, it smiles at guests, it waits for the moment no one believes it's possible. The Whitmore case was closed, but its lesson remained open. Years later, a new family lived in the house where Daniel died. They redecorated, repainted, changed the furniture. Children played where investigators once stood. Laughter returned to rooms that had held silence. Life reclaimed the space. It always does. And yet, every Christmas Eve, when lights glow softly and families gather around tables filled with food and tradition, the story lingers. Not in that house specifically, but everywhere, in the unspoken truth that trust is powerful and dangerous. because the greatest harm is rarely inflicted by enemies. It comes from those we invite closest, those we believe without question, those we never imagined would choose betrayal. Emily Whitmore will spend decades living with that choice, not with anger, not with justification, but with the quiet, unavoidable knowledge that she crossed a line she can never uncross on a night meant for forgiveness, warmth, and peace. Christmas will come again and again for everyone else, but for her, it will always be the night everything ended. And justice, slow and imperfect as it is, will stand as the final witness, not shouting, not celebrating, just watching.